I thank the Council for the opportunity to discuss the utter humanitarian catastrophe engulfing Sudan. 18 months have passed since brutal fighting erupted between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. The suffering is growing by the day, with almost 25 million people now requiring assistance. The people of Sudan are living through a nightmare of violence, with thousands of civilians killed and countless others facing unspeakable atrocities, including widespread rape and sexual assaults. In recent days, we have heard shocking reports of mass killings and sexual violence in villages in Al Jazeera state in the east of the country. They are also enduring a nightmare of hunger, as more than 750,000 people face catastrophic food insecurity and famine conditions take hold in displacement sites in North Darfur, while millions struggle to feed themselves every day. They are confronting a nightmare of disease, with cholera, malaria, dengue fever, measles, and rubella spreading fast. A nightmare of collapsed infrastructure, with vital health systems, transportation networks, water and sanitation systems, supply routes, and agricultural production grinding to a halt. A nightmare of displacement, the largest displacement crisis in the world, with more than 11 million people fleeing since April last year, including nearly 3 million who have crossed into neighboring countries. A nightmare of extreme weather, with nearly 600,000 people affected by heavy rains and floods this summer. And Sudan is once again rapidly becoming a nightmare of mass ethnic violence, in particular with the dramatic escalation of fighting in Al-Fashar. Madam President, we have consistently appealed to both sides to end the fighting and come to the negotiating table. But instead of lowering tensions, they are escalating military action. Meanwhile, outside powers are fueling the fire. We face the serious possibility of the conflict igniting regional instability from Sahel to the Horn of Africa to the Red Sea. Resolution 2736, adopted earlier this year, sent a strong signal, but we need action on the ground. The resolution requested me to make recommendations to protect civilians in Sudan, which I submitted to this Council last week. Allow me to outline 3 key priorities. First, both sides must immediately agree to a cessation of hostilities. Such an agreement should be translated into local ceasefires and humanitarian pauses, creating new avenues of dialogue and laying the ground for a comprehensive ceasefire. At the same time, diplomatic efforts must be intensified to finally bring an end to the conflict, including support to implement the commitments in the Jeddah Declaration. My personal envoy, Ramtan Lamamra, is working around the clock with that objective. He convened the parties in Geneva to enhance humanitarian access and strengthening the protection of civilians in Sudan. And he supported the coordination of mediation initiatives in collaboration with regional partners, in particular the African Union's high-level panel. I urge the Council to continue to support these efforts and encourage effective engagement with regional partners like the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the League of Arab States, and other key ones. And I salute the efforts of the African Union and IGAD towards an inclusive Sudanese political dialogue, which would provide an important platform for civilians, including women, to speak out about the importance of ending the war and lend their voices towards a peaceful and democratic future. Which brings me to my second point: civilians must be protected. We need this Council's support to help protect civilians in line with human rights and international humanitarian law, including the parties' own commitments in the Jeddah Declaration. The parties to the conflict bear the primary responsibility to ensure the protection of civilians and come to the negotiating table. I am horrified by the Rapid Support Forces' continued attacks against civilians in Al-Fashar and surrounding areas, which include displacement sites where famine conditions have been confirmed. And I'm also horrified by reports of attacks against civilians perpetrated by forces affiliated with the Sudanese Armed Forces in Khartoum, and by continued mass civilian casualties due to apparently indiscriminate airstrikes in populated areas. The perpetrators of serious violations of international humanitarian law must be held accountable. And domestic and international human rights monitoring and investigation mechanisms must have space for documenting what is happening on the ground. Civil society and journalists must be able to do their jobs safely without fear of persecution and attacks. The direct or indirect flow of weapons and ammunition into Sudan, which continue to fuel this conflict, must cease immediately. Diverse Sudanese voices, human rights organizations and others have called for stepped-up measures, including some form of impartial force to protect civilians. These calls are a reflection of the gravity and urgency of the situation facing civilians in the country. At present, the conditions do not exist for the successful deployment of United Nations force to protect civilians in Sudan. The Secretariat stands ready to engage with the Council and others on the range of operational mobilities that can meaningfully contribute to the reduction in violence and the protection of civilians. And this may require new approaches that are adapted to the challenging circumstances of the conflict.
Third, humanitarian aid must flow. Despite ongoing access and funding challenges, the United Nations and its partners reached about 12 million people with humanitarian assistance between January and September of this year. Water, sanitation and shelter, healthcare, education, and emergency nutrition have been provided. Nevertheless, huge gaps remain. Many of those we've reached have been assisted just once. Some of the areas most in need remain completely cut off. Rapid, safe, and unfettered humanitarian access must be ensured through all necessary routes, cross-border and cross-line. The reopening of the Adre border crossing was an important step, and this border crossing must remain open. I urge the parties to allow more life-saving aid to flow into the areas where the need is greatest and for it to flow through the most efficient routes. We need humanitarian workers moving around the country and doing so rapidly and safely. What we also need is funding. Our humanitarian funding appeal of $2.7 billion is only about 56% funded, and the coverage of the regional refugee response plan is even lower. I urge donors to step up with additional flexible funding. Having said that, I would like to pay tribute to the valor of the leaders of many Sudanese-led initiatives providing vital and life-saving assistance on the ground. Sudan's emergency response rooms, of which there are over 700, are an inspiring example of grassroots humanitarian action. Through their work, humanitarians, men and women, are showing us another side of Sudan, the best of humanity in a country enduring the worst of it. We can all draw inspiration from their example. Madam President, as I outlined in my report to this Council, it is time for action, for decisive action, for peace and for the people of Sudan. I thank you.